A small, dimly lit diner on a freezing winter night. Snow taps softly against the window. A young mother sits across from her daughter. Their table is almost empty. Just water. The little girl, about 6, looks at the menu, then at her mom. She whispers quietly, "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" The mother freezes. Her hands tremble. She forces a smile, but her eyes fill with tears. At the next table, a man stops eating. A single dad. He hears everything. He looks at them and slowly stands up. He knows that pain. The true journey of hope begins now. Daniel Hayes was a man who understood the architecture of a heavy life. At 42, his body was a living map of hard labor, shoulders broadened by years of lifting massive steel beams, and hands calloused by the unrelenting, bitter grit of Chicago construction sites. He was a supervisor now, a man respected by his crew for his efficiency and his profound silence. But beneath the high-visibility vest and the dusty work boots was a heart that had been hollowed out by a sudden, jagged loss. 3 years ago, he lost his wife, Sarah, to a car accident on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The kind of ordinary day that turns into a permanent scar. Since then, Daniel had become an unintended expert in the delicate, exhausting art of solo parenting, balancing the demands of a high-pressure construction schedule with the infinitely more complex task of raising a 9-year-old boy named Noah. His life was stable, but it was a stability built on a razor's edge. Every dollar was planned with the precision of a blueprint. Every hour was structured to ensure he never missed a school event. He lived in a modest apartment where the fridge was always organized, the bills were paid exactly 3 days before they were due, and the silence of the evenings was often filled by the rhythmic scratching of Noah's pencils as he conquered his 4th-grade math. Daniel didn't have room for extra. He didn't have room for surprises. But he understood struggle with a depth that only those who have rebuilt their lives from the ground up can truly know. He knew exactly what it felt like to look at a bank balance and calculate down to the cent how many days of heating that number represented in a Chicago winter. On this particular evening, the hawk wind was howling off Lake Michigan, turning the city into a white, blinding void. Daniel and Noah had just finished a long, grueling day. Noah at a freezing, late-afternoon soccer practice, and Daniel at a site that was running 3 weeks behind schedule. They decided to stop at Old Joe's, a small, warm diner that had served as their sanctuary on special occasions. For Noah, a diner burger was a grand event, a reward for an A on a science test. For Daniel, it was a rare moment to just sit and breathe, to watch his son be happy in the warm, amber glow of the neon lights while the world outside slowly froze over. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, fried onions, and old wood. A comforting, honest scent. They were sitting in their usual booth, Noah excitedly detailing the mechanics of his latest Lego spaceship project, when the bell above the door chimed. A lonely, high-pitched sound. A woman and a young girl stepped in, bringing a sharp gust of freezing air with them. Daniel's internal radar, honed by years of managing high-stress environments where safety depended on noticing the smallest details, immediately caught things most people would ignore. The woman, who couldn't have been more than 29, was wearing a wool coat that was far too thin for a mid-January night. Her movements were stiff, not just from the cold, but from a profound, radiating tension that seemed to vibrate off her skin. The little girl, around 6, was pale and small for her age, but she had eyes that were sharp and observant, the kind of eyes children develop when they are forced to watch their parents for signs of a brewing storm. They sat at the booth directly adjacent to Daniel and Noah. When the waitress approached, the mother, Emma Carter, asked only for 2 glasses of water and said they were still deciding. Daniel watched from the corner of his eye as she opened the tattered menu, her fingers tracing the prices rather than the food items. She wasn't looking for what they liked. She was looking for what they could survive without. He saw her lips moving in a silent, desperate calculation as she looked at the coins she had pulled from her pocket. A handful of silver and copper that looked like a very small defense against a very large world. Then the fragile silence of the nearly empty diner was shattered by a whisper that felt louder than a construction whistle. Lucy, the little girl, looked up at her mother with a devastatingly sincere expression, her voice trembling with the weight of a realization no child should ever have to make. "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" Emma froze. The menu in her hand shook so violently that the plastic cover rattled against the table. She didn't look at Lucy immediately. She looked at the wood grain of the table, her jaw tight as she fought back the tide of a total emotional breakdown. When she finally looked up, she forced a smile that was a masterpiece of sacrificial love. A smile that was a mask intended to protect her daughter from the truth. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood in a fire. "We're just having a light snack tonight. We'll be fine. Tomorrow will take care of itself." Daniel Hayes heard the lie. He saw the tremor in Emma's hands. And in that moment, the supervisor, who usually looked for structural flaws in buildings, realized he was looking at a structural flaw in the world itself. He saw a mother who was ready to disappear so her daughter could exist. The child's innocent question reveals a reality too heavy for her age, exposing the invisible war that thousands of families fight in the dark. Daniel Hayes sat perfectly still, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. The sounds of the diner, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the muffled roar of the wind, all seemed to fade into a dull, distant static. All he could hear was the echo of that little girl's question. It was a question that demanded an answer the world wasn't giving her. He looked at Noah, who had also stopped talking. Noah was only 9, but he had grown up with a father who taught him that the most important part of a man's strength wasn't his muscles. It was his ability to notice when someone else's strength had run out. Noah leaned in and whispered, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and empathy. "Dad, are they okay? Why did she say that about starving?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched Emma. He saw her close the menu and look at the price of a single side of toast. He saw her count out those crumpled bills and the handful of change again, her lips moving in that same desperate arithmetic. He recognized that look. It was the look of pride being crushed by the weight of a child's hunger. He knew that if he walked over and simply offered her a $20 bill, she would likely refuse out of a fierce, jagged sense of dignity. He knew that in her world, charity felt like an admission of failure, a public mark of being unable to provide. He took a slow, deep breath and made a decision. He wasn't going to offer her charity. He was going to offer her a way out that preserved her soul. He stood up calmly, his large frame casting a long shadow on the floor, and walked over to their table. He didn't tower over them. He leaned slightly against the edge of the booth, keeping his posture relaxed and his voice low and friendly, using the same tone he used to settle a dispute on a job site. "Excuse me, ma'am," Daniel said, his tone carrying the steady professional weight of a man who knew how to fix things. "I'm really sorry to interrupt your evening, but I think the kitchen made a massive mistake with our order." Emma looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, defensive, and ready to fight. She was prepared for a complaint about the noise or a judgmental stare from a stranger, but she wasn't prepared for the man standing before her. I'm sorry," she stammered, her hand instinctively moving toward Lucy. Daniel gestured toward his own table, where Noah was now watching with a small, knowing smile. "My son and we ordered the family platter and 2 extra sides of sliders. We were celebrating a big school project he just finished, but I think the waiter over-ordered for us by about half. The kitchen already made it, and they told me they can't take it back once it's hit the table." He paused, letting the lie settle into the air like warm steam from a cup of coffee. "It's a huge waste of good food, and honestly, we're already stuffed. Would you and your daughter be willing to help us finish it? I'd hate to see it go in the trash." Emma stared at him. She saw through the lie instantly. She saw the way Daniel was looking at her, not with the cold pity of a benefactor, but with a profound, masculine respect. He wasn't looking down at her. He was looking at her like a neighbor who needed a hand with a heavy load. She looked at Lucy, who was staring at the distant smell of fries with a longing that was almost physical, a hunger that was starting to override her manners. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, a lifetime in a diner. Emma's pride fought a brief, violent war with her maternal instinct. She looked at Daniel's hands, calloused and dirty from work, just like the hands of the people she grew up with. She realized that he knew what it was like to sweat for a living. Finally, she looked back at Daniel and saw the absolute sincerity in his gaze. She realized that he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to make sure a little girl didn't have to worry about the logistics of starvation for one more night. That's very kind of you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rattling the door. "Thank you." Daniel nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture that signaled the deal was closed. "Noah, bring the platter over here. Let's make some room." Within minutes, the two tables were joined. The empty space between them was filled with steaming burgers, golden fries, and bowls of warm tomato soup. Daniel made sure to place the largest portions in front of Lucy and Emma, continuing to talk to Noah about his Lego project as if this were the most normal dinner in the world. He didn't ask for her story. He didn't demand an explanation for why they were there in thin coats. He simply provided a sanctuary where the rain couldn't touch them and the fear couldn't reach them. For the first time in months, Emma didn't have to do the math. Kindness enters quietly, without hurting dignity, proving that the most powerful help is the kind that makes the recipient feel seen, not judged. As the meal progressed, the icy tension that had gripped Emma's shoulders for weeks began to thaw under the heat of the food and the kindness. There is a specific kind of magic in a warm meal, a shared table, and the sound of children laughing. Noah, sensing the need for a distraction, began to share his fries with Lucy, challenging her to build the tallest fry tower in the history of Old Joe's Diner. Lucy smiled, a real gap-toothed smile, for the first time that night. It was a sound that Daniel hadn't expected to move him so much. Daniel watched them, his heart aching with a familiar rhythm. He turned his attention to Emma. He didn't pry, but he offered enough of his own story to create a bridge. He talked about his wife Sarah, about the long nights after the accident, and the challenges of being a single dad in a city that never stops moving. Slowly, brick by brick, Emma began to talk back. The story she told was one that is happening in every city, every single night, behind closed doors. Twist 1, the cascading failure. Emma hadn't always been in this position. 6 months ago, she was a mid-level supervisor at a regional logistics company, a job she had held with pride for 5 years. But the company had restructured, which was a corporate code for firing the people with the highest seniority to save on benefits. She had been laid off without a severance package. She had tried to work 2 part-time jobs, but in a city with failing public transit and astronomical childcare costs, the math of her life simply stopped working. She was working 60 hours a week and still falling further behind. Twist 2, the hidden debt. The layoff was the start, Emma said, her voice dropping as she watched Lucy play. But it was the medical bills that broke the foundation. Lucy had a severe respiratory infection last winter. We didn't have insurance after the layoff. I had to choose between the specialist and the rent. I chose the specialist. I'd choose it 1,000 times again. She looked at the burger in front of her as if it were a holy relic. I've been choosing between rent and food for 6 weeks now. Every time I pay the landlord, I have to find a way to explain to a 6-year-old why we're having water soup for dinner. Tonight, the money just ran out. We came in here just to get out of the wind. Daniel listened without interrupting. He didn't offer a 5-point plan or a list of phone numbers for local charities. He simply stayed present. He knew from his own time in the military that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person in a foxhole is just stay in the hole with them until the shelling stops. He realized that Lucy's question, "Will we starve tomorrow?" wasn't a hypothetical fear. It was a logical conclusion based on a child's astute observation of her mother's silent, losing battle with poverty. "My wife used to say that life is like a construction project," Daniel said softly, his eyes reflecting the warm amber of the diner lights. "Sometimes the foundation shifts. Sometimes the materials don't show up on site on time. And sometimes you just have to wait for the storm to pass so you can see where the structural damage is." He looked at Emma, his gaze steady. "You aren't failing, Emma. You're just in the middle of a very long, very loud storm, and no one survives a storm like this alone." Emma wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. her eyes shining. I'm just so tired of being strong, Daniel. I'm tired of lying to her. I'm tired of wondering if the next knock on the door is the eviction notice. I'm tired of being invisible. Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand near hers. He didn't grab it. He just offered a presence of absolute, unshakable stability. This was the real crisis of poverty. Not just the lack of calories, but the total, soul-crushing isolation of the what if that governed every waking hour. He saw a woman who was a hero in her own right, a woman who had sacrificed her own health and hunger to keep a little girl's eyes bright. He saw the man he might have been if he hadn't had a support system. If you believe the real crisis isn't hunger, but the quiet fear of not surviving tomorrow, type, I will be kind. The dinner lasted an hour, but for Emma it felt like the first hour of peace she had experienced in years. She watched Noah and Lucy exchange stickers from Noah's backpack, and she realized that for one night, the world wasn't a predator. She realized that Daniel Hayes wasn't just a stranger who bought them a meal. He was a reminder that her humanity was still intact. He didn't see a poor woman. He saw a mother. He didn't see a case study. He saw a neighbor who was carrying a heavy beam alone. Act 3, emotional mark. The real crisis isn't hunger. It's the quiet, corrosive fear of being forgotten by the world while you're fighting for your child's life. After the meal, as the diner began to dim the lights for the final close of the night, Emma tried to find the words to thank Daniel. She felt a strange, unfamiliar mix of lightness and overwhelming gratitude. I don't know how to repay you for this, Daniel. Not just the food, but for tonight, for treating us like we mattered. Daniel stood up, putting on his heavy work jacket. We've all needed a hand with a heavy beam at some point, Emma. My wife used to say that kindness isn't a debt, it's a foundation. You don't pay it back, you just build something on top of it. He gave her a small, respectful nod and walked toward the counter to pay the bill. But Daniel Hayes was not a man who did things halfway. He was a supervisor. He was a man who saw a structural flaw and felt a deep, instinctive need to fix it. While Emma was helping Lucy into her thin coat, Daniel leaned over to the diner's manager, a man named Mike he had known for over a decade. He pulled out his credit card and made two distinct, life-altering transactions. The first was a prepaid grocery credit at the diner, $300 that allowed Emma to come in and order whatever she and Lucy needed for the next month. No questions asked. He told the manager to tell her it was part of a local neighborhood outreach program, so she wouldn't feel the weight of a personal debt. The second thing he did was more significant. The next morning, as soon as the sun hit the frost-covered glass of his office, Daniel called a friend who managed the regional logistics hub for a major retailer. He didn't ask for a favor. He recommended a professional. He told his friend about a woman who had managed a warehouse team for 5 years and had the kind of integrity that made her choose her child's health over her own pride. He spent the rest of the morning arranging a job interview for Emma Carter. He didn't tell her it was a gift. He sent her a simple, professional text message with the address and the name of the hiring manager saying, I heard they're looking for a supervisor with your exact background. They're desperate for someone with your experience. They'd be lucky to have you. Give them a call. CTA community moment. If you believe true help doesn't just fix today, but protects tomorrow, type, I will help quietly. Emma received the text while she was sitting in a public library, trying to find a warmth that didn't cost $1. She looked at the screen, then at the job description. It was a role that paid twice what she had been making. It was a role with benefits. It was a future. For the first time in 6 months, Emma Carter didn't feel like she was drowning in the middle of the Atlantic. She felt like someone had reached into the black water and pulled her onto a solid, dry dock. She realized that Daniel hadn't just given her a burger. He had given her a chance to stop being a victim of circumstance and start being a provider again. She stood up, her eyes bright with a new, fierce determination. She had an interview. She had a tomorrow. She had a name again. True help doesn't just fix today. It protects tomorrow, proving that the greatest gift you can give a person is the opportunity to save themselves. 4 weeks later, the Chicago winter was still biting, and the wind was still sharp. But inside Old Joe's diner, the air was warm and smelled of fresh coffee and renewed hope. The bell above the door chimed, and a woman stepped in. She was wearing a new, thick, navy blue winter parka and a look of quiet, hard-earned confidence. Beside her, a little girl skipped toward a booth, her cheeks rosy from the cold, and her eyes full of the kind of energy that only comes from a full stomach and a peaceful heart. Emma Carter had secured the job. She was 3 weeks into her new role, and her first paycheck had already stabilized their world. The eviction notice was a memory. The water soup was a thing of the past. Lucy was back in school, her health restored, and she no longer watched her mother's face for signs of rain. She was allowed to be a child again. Daniel and Noah were already there, sitting in their usual booth. Lucy ran straight to Daniel and gave him a fierce, sudden hug around his waist. "Daniel, look, Mommy got me the red boots with the fur." Daniel smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his tired, rugged face. He looked at Emma, who was standing by the table, her eyes shimmering with a gratitude that went far beyond the capacity of words. She didn't have to say anything. The way she stood, the way she laughed with the waitress, and the way she ordered a full breakfast for Lucy spoke for itself. "We're doing well, Daniel," Emma said softly, sitting down across from him. "I don't know if I ever said it, but you saved more than just a dinner that night." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Noah and Lucy as they compared stickers on the back of a menu. "I told you, Emma, it was just a shift in the foundation. You did the heavy lifting. You did the rebuilding." Later that night, as Daniel drove Noah home through the glowing, busy city streets, Noah asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Dad, why did we really give them that food? And why did you help her get that job? We don't even know them." Daniel pulled the truck to a stop at a red light and looked at his son. He thought about the cold nights after Sarah died, and the neighbor who brought over casseroles for a month without ever being asked. He thought about the man who gave him his first job when he was just a kid with nothing but a wrench and a dream. "Because, Noah," Daniel said, his voice a low, steady rumble of truth. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most. And because in this world we're all just one storm away from needing a seat at someone else's table. Real strength isn't about what you can keep for yourself. It's about what you can give when the world gets dark. I want you to be a man who builds bridges, not walls." Voiceover ending. It wasn't a miracle from the sky. It wasn't a grand cinematic gesture. It was just one quiet decision made by a man who chose to listen to a child's whisper. But for one little girl, it meant she never had to ask that heartbreaking question again. Because of a stranger's kindness, she finally knew that she would never have to starve tomorrow. And Emma learned that even in the coldest winter, hope is the one thing that never freezes. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Chip Healing Stories, where small kindness changes lives.